Well, good afternoon. If you are in Denton, Texas, or Baltimore, Maryland, or New York City, good evening if you are in Berlin, where my engineer Johan is. People who have watched this show for the past 3 years have known that I can't do this alone. I've had a magnificent engineer for most of the shows named Johan. This will be his last show, and he will be deeply missed. And I want all of you who have watched these shows to acknowledge his wonderful work. Greetings as always, and special love to our loved ones in Ukraine, and hello to people around the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. For Johan's last show, I have two really wonderful guests. Both gentlemen are deeply engaged in subject matter that I care very deeply about. And I'm happy that they're joining me. We have Dr. Kris Chesky, I will call him Kris, and I'm going to read your full title. Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in Performing Arts Health at the Peabody Institute and School of Medicine. I don't know if you printed your business cards yet, but you're either going to have a very big card or very small type on the card. Welcome, Kris.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred.
And then we have Dr. Fred Bronstein, whose business card is no less distinguished, but much shorter and to the point. He's the dean of the Peabody Institute, which is the oldest music conservatory in the United States. And both of them join me from Baltimore, Maryland, one of my favorite cities in the United States. So welcome, Fred.
Nice to be here, Fred. Thanks for having me and having Kris, and we're looking forward to the conversation.
So let's start actually with Baltimore, which is a city that is underappreciated. It is, as I said, one of my favorite cities in our country. When you are in Baltimore, you are unmistakably there and not anywhere else. And it's a wonderful thing because most places in the world now have become rather interchangeable. And Baltimore has its own accent, its magnificent cuisine, which is some of the best food in America. Huge cultural background, great baseball. I'm a baseball guy, and great baseball in Baltimore. Its stadium has the best food of any stadium in the United States for baseball. When you walk around the central part of the city, it's an historic port. You can smell spices that are being ground at the McCormick plant. There's a beautiful fragrance in Baltimore. They have historic markets. It's a very old American city. It's the place where America's national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, was composed. It's a city that people often pass through on their way from Washington to Philadelphia, Wilmington, Delaware, now where President Biden is from, up to New York and New Haven and Boston, but really merits discovery because as an old city, it has what old American cities have. Great medical institutions, great academic institutions, the oldest music conservatory in America, huge amounts of character, cultural diversity, poverty, ethnic and urban challenges. It has everything and is a prototype in many ways for what is best about our country, but also about the challenges our country faces. So I'm happy to go there anytime, and I hope that people listening will make a point of visiting Baltimore if they're visiting the US or if they are Americans to get to know that city. I don't care much about football, so I can't speak to that, but the Orioles are a magnificent baseball team.
It's a good
even
year.
If I'm a Yankee fan. Now, Fred, would you please talk a bit about Peabody and its role in the city, and then something that you've established that I'm very caring about called the 5 pillars?
Yeah. I'm so glad you made all those comments, Fred, about Baltimore, because it is a place that people don't know, or many people don't know, and sometimes a maligned place. Unfortunately, it is in fact a wonderful city, as you point out, for all the reasons that you pointed out. And just the arts environment. We're talking about jazz and hip hop, and the prevalence of individual artists and walking the streets and seeing the murals on buildings. It is really the grassroots artistic level, from the individual artist level up to institutions, is very much part of the history and the richness of the city. And we're talking about Peabody, and interestingly, we are the oldest conservatory, but in fact, the Peabody Institute itself was founded as really the first cultural center in a city in the United States. Which is why when it was founded, it had a lecture series and a concert hall and a library and an art collection. These were all part of George Peabody's vision of what this place should be as a place to provide access to Baltimore citizens for all kinds of culture. So it's really, the way it was founded is really unique. And so in many ways, fast forward to 165 years later, and you think about it, the way I think about the school today is this idea that this, very deep, long tradition that is wonderful and goes really, as I said, goes really wide and deep. At the same time, it is a very forward-looking kind of school. We think about how do you layer innovation, and that'll bring us to, of course, what we're going to talk about today, performing arts and health. But how do you layer innovation on a deep tradition? They're not incompatible. In fact, that they go beautifully together. We're able to think about the future because the past is so strong for us, and because the foundation is so strong. And so, as we were thinking about, when I came here nearly 10 years ago to Peabody and to Baltimore, I really thought about, Peabody in terms of the 5 pillars that we had identified in our strategic plan at that time, which were about excellence. Well, that one's obvious in a way, right? Because it is, we're a top conservatory. We are all about finding the best students, attracting the best faculty, and turning out the best artists that we possibly can. But it goes beyond that, actually, because, when we start talking about things like innovation and community connectivity, we are thinking about turning out artists that are not just steeped in traditional training and wonderful players or composers or dancers or whatever it is their discipline may be, but that in fact they are surrounding those skills with all of the skills of flexibility and adaptability and communication skills and all the things they're going to need to bring to be a successful artist in the 21st century. It is a very different world today than it was when Peabody started to train musicians 165 years ago. And so, this being very, very steeped in the past, but really focused on the future, I think is so important a part of what Peabody is doing today. And it's manifested in everything from the breakthrough curriculum, which teaches our students these skills, to performing arts and health, to music and technology, and lots of other things as well. I think also, and this also comes back to the performing arts and health piece, this idea, one of the things that was so attractive to me about Peabody was it's one of the schools of this magnificent university, Johns Hopkins University, which is by anybody's measure a remarkable place. And so I was really intrigued when I came here about the possibilities of the interdisciplinary space, and what does that look like for a conservatory, particularly in a university that is so STEM-based, medical, the medical facility and research and healthcare, and then of course, science-based, and for us to be really kind of unique in the, in the environment of Hopkins. And so this, one of the most obvious places in a way was the performing arts and health, and to say, if you're going to do that kind of work in performing arts and medicine, what better place to do it than at a place like this, which has of course led us to, under Sarah Hoover's leadership, one of our associate deans, really, expand this footprint and now get us to the point where we could bring somebody like Kris to Peabody. And the one final thing two other things I would say about the pillars, because you mentioned them, is the community connectivity piece. I think that, Baltimore is a, in many ways, a big small town. And I think that, so how you touch the community is both immediate and critical. And so, that happens in every way, from the preparatory, which touches many people across Baltimore, and particularly programs like our Tuned In program, which identifies, underrepresented, very talented young kids, gives them free lessons, training, so that they can actually aspire to come into the field of the performing arts. It's a really unique program for us. And so, connection with the community, what our students do in the community as part of their training and community engagement, what our faculty are doing in the community, a jazz, partnership that happens between Peabody and led by our jazz chair, Sean Jones, and Keystone Corner, which is a wonderful jazz place here in Baltimore. So there's so many things, I think, that touch on community here. And finally, diversity. I want to say that I think that one of the things I'm most proud about Peabody is it's the leadership position it's taking around how do we change the field of the performing arts? Because for me, it is diversity is an existential question. It is we are in a field that traditionally has not had the diversity that it needs to have, particularly as we look at demographics changing in this country. And when you marry those demographics to audience trends, and who makes up that audience today, it's not a good equation for what the future of the classical performing arts looks like in the United States. And so changing the face of that field and changing and broadening the range and breadth of creative voices in that field becomes so critical. And so recruiting students, of underrepresented students and faculty and staff, and broadening the curriculum so that it really reflects this broader range of creative voices. All of these things are really critical and as I say, existential for the field. So those are all sort of the pillars and how they relate in a very direct way to what we're doing today.
I'm just going to amplify for our listeners on a couple of things because we have an international audience. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And many of us, I'm sure you guys both too, talk about STEAM, where we add the word A for the arts into the equation, and the connectivity, the relationship of the arts to these sciences and mathematics. And I do have to add it, since we're talking about jazz, that Billie Holiday was born in Baltimore, and Babe Ruth, arguably the greatest baseball player, was born in Baltimore. So it's really a very iconic American city. Baltimore has also the Baltimore Symphony, which had for a very long time Marin Alsop as its music director. She was on the show a couple of years ago, and I tried not to ask her the typical question she's asked about what's it like to be the first woman, the only woman, and so on. We spoke about music, and I think that she was very gratified for that. And I'm not recalling his name, but there is a new African-American conductor.
Jonathan Hayward.
Jonathan Hayward, yes, who I do hope to have on this show.
Yeah.
So Baltimore is leading the way and has led the way for a long time in this regard.
If I can also just
yes.
say, thing, Fred, that Marin actually was the first faculty member I hired when I got to Peabody.
Okay.
They were very well from the orchestra world, of course, and she directs our graduate conducting program, which is one of the best conducting programs.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
So I just want to add about you. You were at St. Louis Symphony before.
Yeah, I began my career with orchestras, so I was at the St. Louis Symphony, and prior to that with the Dallas Symphony. So yeah.
I've done work for the Dallas Symphony. I've never been to St. Louis, but I did one program for you. I remember the date, November 22nd, 2013. It was at Carnegie Hall, and the St. Louis Symphony was doing Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes.
Yep.
Conducted by David Robertson and starring Anthony Dean Griffey. Yep. And I was the pre-performance lecturer on the stage of Carnegie Hall.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was there. So
yeah, that was me. Now, Kris, you two have a long, important career, and you arrived in Baltimore yesterday. So in my introduction, I mentioned Denton, Texas. Why did I mention Denton, Texas?
Well, so I'm from Holyoke, Massachusetts, born and raised. My family is still up there. I guess I'm a second generation American. My grandparents immigrated from Poland. And they had a very musical family, very strong musical traditions. My uncles played, and we had a lot of music. And after high school, and went off to music school in Boston and attended Berklee College of Music with a jazz degree in trumpet. And I was playing professionally for several years and started thinking about getting a graduate degree. So I went to Denton, Texas, because of its famed jazz program, and finished my master's and doctorate there, and segued into a position that they created for me in development of a center. And 30 years later, moving on. So that's the short of it.
And just to clarify, that used to be called North Texas State University. Now it's the University of North Texas.
That's
And
correct.
it has a very important music school. And those of us who live in the Northeast tend to talk about schools along the Northeastern corridor from Berkeley to Yale to Juilliard and Manhattan School of Music and Mannes and Academy of Vocal Arts in Philadelphia and Curtis and Peabody and so forth. But there is a lot of great music education outside of this corridor. Cincinnati College of Music, University of North Texas. There are many University of Michigan all around the country, Indiana University, University of Southern California. I could name many, many more, and I don't want to leave anybody out. But by any measurement, the University of North Texas is right up there with the major institutions of musical education. And Fred, it was your idea to create this new program, or did Kris come to you with the idea? How did this happen?
No, so one of my first, well, going back to when I got here, there was a little bit of activity going on in the area of performing arts and health. There were one or two professors over on the medicine side that had some interest in music-related, performance-related injury, issues attached to that, influence of music on health in general, but not a tremendous amount going on, kind of bits and pieces. And so one of my first hires was Sarah Hoover, who was our associate dean, who was really, leading the effort in this area. And Sarah, I think, immediately understood sort of the possibilities and the connections that could be made. And we thought about this from really two perspectives. One was the very selfish perspective, if you will, of being fully aware of performance-related injury, having run, major orchestras and seen firsthand, the devastation that can occur, and the threats to careers and just the many serious issues that are attached to being an athlete, as you are when you're a musician or a dancer. And on the other side of that, the second prong being, how is music and dance, what is the value of that in, as a non-invasive intervention for medical conditions, whether you're talking about Parkinson's, you're talking about Alzheimer's, or whatever else it might be. And in fact, beyond that, things like public health. And so as we started to think, the project began early on with, a couple of partnerships with neurology. There was a Parkinsonian guitar program that we started in conjunction with neurology. There was an Alzheimer's choir that had caregivers and Alzheimer's patients side by side. A number of studies that were being done. That led to the creation of, with our partners over in rehabilitative medicine, of the creation of a clinic actually on the Peabody campus that we have today, that we started, I think, 4 or 5 years ago now. And so it's been, like a lot of things that happen at Hopkins. Hopkins is a very organic place. There are incredible ideas from incredible people, and it's a very decentralized university. And so, ideas pop up. And so as this idea started to grow, we started in the Sound Rounds program, which is, our musicians and others going over now into the hospital and doing things with patients and with staff over at the hospital, whole range of things like that. And so it's been this emerging footprint. And, as it's emerged, one of the things that we've been really interested in, about 5 years ago, Mike Bloomberg, who's been a very, very generous and important supporter of Johns Hopkins University, and indeed of Peabody, started a program, gave the money to start a program called the Bloomberg Distinguished Professorship, which now is, I think there are probably 80 or so, I may have the number exactly, but between 80 and 100, I would say, across the university, Bloomberg Distinguished Professors. And Peabody did not have one. We had looked at several possibilities over the years. We were looking for the right fit, what was the right topic that we wanted to focus on. And frankly, it took us really a long time for us to really, and the wait was really worth it, because I think when we found Kris, we realized we found the person that had been doing the kind of work we were so interested in, at the University of at Texas, North Texas. I have to call it the right thing, and was thinking about all of the issues that we were thinking about. Had done substantial research in these areas, and so we were really interested in bringing academic leadership to these programs now that they're really starting to blossom. And this, may include future academic programs and lots of other things that are being looked at, but bringing somebody of his caliber, that has a lifetime of expertise, around an issue, this issue that he's passionate about, that, that this is the next really important step, we think, for us in this program here at Hopkins.
I want to say something formally to our audience that the three of us know parenthetically, but I want to say it. Johns Hopkins University is one of the great universities in this country. And I think most people, when we say the name, associate it with medicine, because it's one of the top medical schools and research institutes. I constantly read their website for medical information and advice. And if I'm exploring a medical concept, it's one of the places that I will always go to, along with Harvard and the Mayo Institute and a few others, but always I go to Hopkins first. There's that, but it's not only that. One of my dearest friends got his doctorate in German literature at Hopkins and is a professor at Columbia. My connection to Hopkins relates to its School of International Affairs, because I did a lot of my musical training in the city of Bologna in Italy. Okay. And I was the American who was not at Hopkins, but because I was really the only American who was not at Hopkins, I hung out a lot at the Hopkins Institute on Via Zambello number 3. And I got to know many of the students of international affairs there, and they've gone on to become diplomats, and I have maintained friendships with them. And with them, we often explored how music and the arts work in diplomacy and an official context in terms of sharing and understanding cultures. So my way in actually to Hopkins is that, rather than musical, medical, or anything else. But it's a magnificent school that I want people to look into. Kris, you come from a musical background, but clearly there's this interest in the medical aspect as well. How did that evolve?
When I was packing to move my house, all my belongings, I guess you could say I'm a little bit of a hoarder. I keep stuff sentimental to me, and so I was digging through things and making a decision as to whether to bring it or not. And I found 2 cassette tapes that caught my eye. And I think maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago, I thought I had these tapes, and I started looking for them back then. No luck. And then I found this tape and I listened to it. And sure enough, it was what I hoped it was, which was my senior high school spring concert. So when I was a senior in high school, the Holyoke High, we had the big concert at the end of the year. And I was class musician, and the big concert and the jazz band, all that. And I was playing a lot of solos. And so I'm listening to this going, wow, that's just great memories for me. And then at the end of the evening, the band director, his name was Edward Nowak, was introducing some students and making some comments and giving some scholarships and all that. And he saved me for last. And this is why I was kind of curious to listen to this and look for it, because even at that point, here my band director on this tape is saying, oh, you've all heard some, wonderful trumpet playing tonight, and we want to applaud Kris. And as I was walking up to the stage to receive an envelope with a little check in it or something, he says something like, Kris is going to go off and be involved in music and engineering or acoustics. He's going to connect the science of music to music and all this. So I don't know where he got that from. And sure enough, so there was, I think, a connection even back then. I was always involved with or interested in, sound. My dad built a stereo into the wall of the house I grew up in, and I always loved to find that record and put it on the turntable and listen. Just the idea of sound energy, build my own speakers when I went off to college, things like this. And then later, in fact, when I was at Berkeley, I took as many acoustics courses as I could. And then later, when I ended up in Texas, I had a couple of very profound experiences musically. One of them was being invited to play in a church in Dallas. And at the time, my church experience was very limited and didn't grow up in a very religious family, and went to the Polish Catholic Church on Easter and Christmas and baptisms and funerals and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I'd met this lady on a cruise ship. In fact, I was in the Caribbean. I was playing trumpet on cruise ships, and I was telling her about, hey, I want to go back to school, and I was telling her about maybe going west of the Mississippi for the first time to Texas, and she gave me her business card. She said, if you ever do that, give me a call. I know some musicians, maybe I can help you get some work. So, okay, so sure enough, 8 months later or whatever, I'm in Dallas and I called this lady and she said, oh, okay, great. It's amazing you're here. Let me make some phone calls and I'll call you back, which she did. And then she said, gee, you're all set for this Sunday. I want you to go down to this church in Dallas. I was like, no. You saw what I do on the cruise ships. I'm thinking the church up in Massachusetts, and that's not my experience as a musician nor my interests. She said, no, trust me. So I went down to this mega church down in Dallas that I ended up playing in for 11 years. In fact, it helped fund my college education. And it was a televised, I guess you would say, Bible Belt boogie band of extraordinary talent and skill. And they brought in all the elements of dance and jazz and gospel and contemporary. It was just an amazing group. And I watched it from the audience, from congregation standpoint, just blown away at the level of performance ability. And I introduced myself at the end of the thing like I was told to. And he said, okay, why don't you come back and you can sub for one of the trumpet players tonight and get paid. So that started something that showed me firsthand as a musician the power of music in a group setting. Because up to this point, I'd play a few concerts, but most of what I did was playing for dancing and playing for entertainment. It really didn't have a deep meaning so much to the audience. And so over the years, I got those experiences taught me, wow, this is a very powerful medium in terms of influencing people's behaviors and thinking and belief systems and all that. And then around this time, somebody mentioned to me that there's this field of music therapy. In fact, it was the same lady. Her name was Anna. And she told me that in Denton, there's a state school there that houses people with physical and mental disabilities. And they have this music therapy program. And I was really interested in that. So I went and saw this man work with these people one night as a music therapist. That just exposed something very interesting to me. And I started reading up on that. And I ended up taking some classes over at Texas Women's University, which had, at the time, one of the founding figures of music therapy in the United States. His name was Donald Michel. He was the first president of the American Music Therapy Association. He started the program at Florida State, and he was sort of an older gentleman at the time. And he took me under his wing, and he taught me about the power of music metaphorically as a two-edged sword. In fact, his textbook, by the way, which was translated into Japan, And a couple of years after I met him, this young lady from Japan wrote him a letter, snail mail, by the way, back to our previous conversation. And I remember him opening up this letter saying, wow, there's this young lady who wants to come and do a master's here, music therapy. She doesn't speak English well. So anyway, that lady ended up in Denton, Texas, and I met her, and now she's my wife of 22 years. And so small world. But anyway, so I was really intrigued by this idea of music therapy, and his metaphor with the two-edged sword implied that, and it works two ways. One, on one hand, the power of music can be due to the physical nature of the energy itself, right? So music is an acoustic source, right? It can go out into space and it goes into our ear canals, and it can affect us physically just by virtue of its intensity, for example. I've done quite a bit of research on noise-induced hearing loss and music-induced hearing loss and all that. And it's just due to the physical strength of this energy. And of course, the other side of the double-edged sword is all the psychological, all this meanings, the emotional stuff that music can carry. So I started thinking about that. And the other way this metaphor was applied to music was that it can cut really powerfully in a positive way, but can also cut in a negative way, whether it's just too much energy or perhaps as an occupational health consequence. So I started thinking about that and ended up exploring a combination of those two, I guess, edges of the sword for good. So music in medicine was basically the approach or the direction I took for my doctoral dissertation, where I harnessed the acoustical energy so that I could target a very specific response in a person's body who might be suffering from intense chronic pain. So I was changing acoustical energy into mechanical vibration, developed a device that would stimulate the body of people with rheumatoid arthritis or fibromyalgia or surgery, post-surgery patients, things like this. And the whole idea was to prompt a response in the nervous system that would diminish, almost like putting a dimmer switch on the neurologic signals that are heading to the brain that are carrying the information that's perceived as painful. And of course, the other edge of the sword, you got all the psychological stuff with the music. So we called it a two-pronged approach, the physical and the psychological, efferent versus afferent influences on neural processing in the spinal cord. So I started messing around with that, ended up getting a patent and, doing several funded studies. And by the way, you mentioned Italy. There is a person that's, I think, really important in the discussion, because musicians, while we may say have been understudied and underserved for as long as I've been around, right, for sure. And I went through all this music education all the way through the doctorate. Nobody told me about these things. Oh, you might have a problem with your lip, your jaw, your ear, your hands. I often show my distorted hands, this thumb is stretching back and this one doesn't go back, it's for decades playing trumpet, contracting, extending. Well, anyway, there was a physician in Italy around 1700 named Bernardino Ramazzini. And you know that name? Yeah, he was a pioneer in medicine because he told physicians, look, when you have a patient come to you with some kind of, medical issue, you need to ask them, what do you do? Because he started to see these patterns of disease and health-related problems that are directly connected to these different jobs that people were doing in his village. Mm-hmm. And that was a big breakthrough in medicine, and he's considered the grandfather of occupational medicine, the training of a physician specifically in response to a particular job that somebody might be involved in. And in his pioneering textbook, he wrote a chart. He had a chart in there with listed, 50 or 70, I can't remember exactly, different occupations where he saw these patterns. And sure enough, the singer, the lute maker, the musician, they were there, So anyway, when I was finishing up this music vibration, not finishing up, but sort of looking to transition into something else, the dean of the College of Music at the University of North Texas was very interested in this. He was a performing musician. He could appreciate what I was doing, and he was just academically curious. He thought I was unusual. He says, "So what are you going to do now, Kris? You're going to get an academic job somewhere?" I said, "I don't really know. I've just been so absorbed in my research and playing." He said, "Look, why don't you talk about what you think is really important for schools of music to pursue?" And that's when we started talking about the lack of education having to deal with the realities of being a musician, whether it's physical, auditory, psychological, economic, social. There's a whole milieu of concerns that nobody taught me about, and I don't see built into most curriculums. And he said, and at that point, I had a strong relationship with the Health Sciences Center of the University of North Texas, which is in Fort Worth. And he says, "Well, why don't we, give you some opportunities to expand what you're doing in this particular direction?" And that's when I started the Center for Music and Medicine. It was in 1999 in Texas. And at that point, my colleague in medicine was a rheumatologist, and he was the one that was mentoring me with some of my dissertation research. And that's sort of how I got into the academic track. And then my first big push was in response to the idea that music schools, from what I was seeing, and I, really don't know much about some of the conservatories that we mentioned earlier. It's just not part of my history. But what was my history was telling me that, musicians, and particularly young people in elementary school, middle school, high school, who take a liking to music, are not informed about these very real consequences, both positively and negatively, and that you need to somehow manage your musical behavior, whether it's practicing or listening, so that you're not going to end up with some kind of problem that could set you back, or maybe even worse, discount you as a potential artist for your whole life. And so I was pushing, or I was trying to understand, how do music schools generally guide themselves? And, and I became aware of the National Association of Schools of Music, which is an accrediting body for the vast majority of schools in the United States, although there's quite a few very prominent schools that don't fall under the accreditation oversight of NASM, like Peabody or USC or Juilliard and Berkeley. But nevertheless, it is a general oversight to about 650 programs. And I thought, well, maybe this is one way that I can gain some insight as to whether or not the accreditation standard even mentions anything about the role of the music school in educating musicians, future educators or performers, about these things. And that led me to sort of challenge the status quo. And I was able to raise some money with the National Endowment for the Arts and the Grammys and a couple others back in 2004, hosted a discussion that led to some recommendations that then led to some accreditation standard changes in 2011, which now stipulate that accredited schools must fully inform all students, faculty, and staff of all health-related consequences associated with performing, learning, consuming music. So that was a big task. But since then, not much has happened. And there's a lack of specific directions that music schools can take, and a lack of identification of roles that individuals within these contexts should play. I guess my general belief is that as a musician, we all, as musicians, we should have certain, perspectives that we're aware of, that we're knowledgeable about, and competent to deal with. We all go to school for music. We all take music theory because we believe that's something we need to be aware of, knowledgeable about, and competent to manage in our musical activities. Well, performing arts health should be one of those core pillars, back to the right. Every musician should know something about this. Mm-hmm. I firmly believe it. But what I sense is that the historical precedence for outlining what a school specifically should do falls short. And because nobody's really articulated that. Yep. So when I meet people like Sarah Hoover and Fred, I get super excited, because here we have administrators saying, yeah, we need to be doing more. We need to be innovating. We need to be taking the lead on articulating roles for the music schools across the world. And then we think down inside of the music school, like what is, for example, we talked about conductors a bit. What is the role of a conductor in managing sound levels during rehearsals and performances? Are they aware of the noise or the sound levels that they generate? Probably not.
Mhm.
Are they aware of, if they realize it is higher than somebody in audiology, for example, might say is risky, are they aware of how to manage that musical behavior so it lessens risk and increases artistic integrity? Probably not. Are there technological means to do these kinds of analytic procedures so that they can learn more and student? Probably not, but certainly potentially there. What's the role of the studio faculty, the primary mentor, for example, of a student who comes to a school and says, hey, I'm yours for 4 years, basically. You know, the difference between somebody who functions as like an apprentice model versus a mentorship model might have huge consequences to the well-being of that student moving forward. What are the role of the courses that we teach? What kind of content should be built into these courses? What kind of oversight should an administrator have in the overall learning environment of a music school? This is something that I'm really interested right now in. When we think about marrying or partnering with different disciplines. I have 3 kids, by the way, with my Japanese wife that I met right from Don Michelle. And my oldest is now just starting her 2nd year of medical school down at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. Terrific cellist and pianist, by the way. And when she was segueing into the application procedures and the essay writings and all that to get into medical school, I started to thinking about, wow, this is stressful. When my little baby she's going into the heat, you know, no question about it. And I started looking at the literature, and I came across an article, and this was when I was working with Sarah Hoover, talking about the directions that Peabody might be pursuing. This is before I was sort of involved as a potential participant in this. But anyway, we were just talking about these things, and I came across this article, and the title was The Johns Hopkins Learning Environment Scale, a Validation Study. Very current in the Journal of Medical Education Research. And I was like, well, Johns Hopkins Medical Education, this is interesting. And I started reading it. And the introduction of this article was specifying the challenges that medical schools students experience. And they were using the acronym COM. And in my mind, COM, College of Music, because I've been at UNT, right? College of Music. And replacing that College of Medicine with College of Music and reading this stuff, it was like, wow, here is so many strong parallels in terms of the performance demands of a medical student, the performance demands, the economic demands, the physical demands, all these kinds of things. I said, my gosh, this is amazing. And that learning environment scale that was developed at Johns Hopkins on behalf of medical student health has now, it's not just this particular research study, but this idea has permeated medical education now across the world, has seeped into other disciplines. It's like, for example, when students get educated to be lawyers now, there's a certain standard of practice to understand the learning environment on behalf of the music students, legal students. Same thing with physical therapy. It's global. I said, wow, what a great thing to kind of consider and integrate into our music education scenarios. So we have a better understanding of how the music student itself experiences the learning environment in ways that could be conducive or, helpful to their health. So it's
Kris, I'm going to interrupt you here because you said a lot, and I want to respond to some of that. Maybe Fred wants to also, but something you said triggered a memory that I have to interject with. And I have to say that I can go for many years without using so-called curse words, but I'm going to use them right here. So be prepared because people don't hear them out of my mouth. In 1988, I had orthopedic surgery. And when they were putting me to sleep with I forget what it's called, the gas that they put you to sleep with, they were playing music that I selected that I liked very much. It was Mozart Caballé. It was very, very nice. And they were doing the surgery, and I think it went longer than anticipated. And I woke up, and the doctors had changed the music from Montserrat Caballé to something really awful and completely unbridled by everything. I said, "What the fuck is that shit you're playing?" And the doctor said, "Stop, you're not a music critic." And they gave me a little more gas and put me back to sleep. My dentist uses Idagio, and I know others who use other streaming services in their offices, so that when patients are being treated, the patient gets to select the music they want, which I think is a very nice way in terms of palliative care. A number of years ago, I was working in Istanbul, and I was walking in the streets of the center city. And like you, Kris, I was working on a cruise ship, and I finished my cruise performing, and I stayed in Istanbul. And the neighborhood of Sultanahmet is the old neighborhood of Istanbul. And I spotted a music shop that had all kinds of unusual instruments in it. And I walked in and admired these beautiful instruments. Turkey has an amazing musical tradition. And then I saw a wall, and there was sort of a medical RX on it. And I asked what that was. We sort of communicated in Italian and French because they didn't have English. And it turned out that this particular music store was kind of like a pharmacy, in that they had recorded music for every medical condition. So that if you had asthma, or if you had arthritis, or you had constipation, or whatever you may have had, they had a recording for you. So a couple of my conditions I bought recordings for and brought them home to New York and listened to them on CD. And I can't attest as to whether they made things better, but I didn't feel worse. But ever since, I've always thought about that shop, that it was in effect a musical pharmacy where the medication was music. And it has informed my thinking. I'm going to add further that a very dear friend of mine of longstanding, an Italian from Milan, studied at Johns Hopkins, as it happens, in the medical school. And she learned a lot in her medical experience here in the States, and went back to Italy and had a very important career in public health in Lombardy, the region Milan is the capital of. And her parents, especially her father, were very important musicians. Her father was the church organist for the Duomo, the main cathedral of Milan. And Giuseppe Verdi, who's my hero, created something in Milan, maybe you know it, called the Casa di Riposo per Musicisti. It's a retirement home for musicians. And
wow.
Verdi said that he believed that the reason he was able to become what he became was because of all these musicians who worked in choruses and orchestras and, smaller opera singer roles and so on. And he died January 27th, 1901, and he didn't want it to open until after his death. It opened October 10th, 1902. He was born October 10th. And in my working career and in my Italian life, I've always been very active at the Casa di Riposo. And my friend's parents wound up there in their later years, the organist and then her mother later on. And the great thing about this Casa di Riposo, and I'll be glad to introduce you guys there, is that Verdi created an environment for music making among retired musicians, so that you have people in their 80s, 90s, and more who get up and sing and play the piano and so on. There is, in fact, a Japanese lady who lived in Italy, and she lives there. And it's a magnificent place, and they have found, and there's an American filmmaker who's making a film about it, that the ongoing engagement with music tends to sustain their mental health better, more fully, and more emotionally, in a more emotionally rewarding way. In recent years, in part with my friend's involvement, they've developed a special ward for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. And when I'm in Milan, I like to go visit people there too, because no one visits them. And on a recent visit, I encountered a woman who was 82, so not ancient, who had been a chorus member in the opera in Verona. And I was told her name, and I spoke to her in Italian. And she said to me, "Would you like me to sing for you?" And I said, "Of course." and she sang a very good, credible version of Puccini's Vici d'arte from Tosca, not by Verdi, but no one's perfect. And musically right, she knew all the words, she had the intonation, she had the dramatic moments involved in the aria. And then afterwards, I thanked her, and she said, for what? She had forgotten that she had sung the aria, but knew it completely enough. And they live in this environment where music is part of the nourishment. Another part of the nourishment, and something I care about very deeply, is good food. And a lot of what I work on is the nutritional elements of singers' health and musicians' health, in terms of inflammation, in terms of upper respiratory heartburn, in terms of breathing, in terms of hypertension, all of that. There's a very profound nutritional link to the health of musicians. So I commend both Istanbul and the Casa di Riposo to you. Fred, does Peabody and do they with Johns Hopkins, is there a nutritional component to the studies as well?
So I know it's something we're talking about. I don't know that we've gone that far, that there is a, you know, that real work has been done on that. I think it probably comes up peripherally. It certainly comes up with our dancers.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you know, we talk a lot about that with the dance faculty, and because there are lots of issues that happen around being a dancer, of course. You know, what you were saying also, I just want to relate one, you know, you were talking about in senior living situations, a program we started actually 4 or 5 years ago was a program where we have students working actually as artists in residence. We've now got 5 of these senior facilities that we work with. They actually literally live there. And they are among the, you know, the residents, and they are rehearsing there and performing there and interacting with the residents. And it is, you know, this is of course a whole other area of you know, in terms of that population and the importance of the arts, and actually specifically, you know, how do you prepare and train students for that kind of work? You know, and I think one of the things that we're, you know, thinking increasingly about is not just, you know, as I said, 2 parts to this. One is the whole musician and dancer health piece, you know, and how do we preserve and train our students to take care of themselves, but also this, you know, this idea of how are we going to use the art form to where it intersects with disease and you know and aging issues. And so the Sound Rounds program, I've mentioned it earlier, is a program where we're training these students to go over and be in the hospital, to be with patients, to be with, and this is also not just for patients, it's for staff and physicians, you know, the medical staff and the administrative staff in a very stressful environment, right? And what can be done and a lot of these folks are also amateur musicians, and very good ones often. And so how do we engage them with music? So there's so many sort of prongs to this, I think. You know, I also want to just say 2 other things about we're talking about Kris, you know, when he was talking earlier about how, you know, how little actually when he was starting out, and I would argue still today, has been done in this field. I think the field is a wide open field in many ways because it's unlike a field like sports medicine, which has gotten much more, I would, you know, say, focus or attention. This is just starting to get that kind of focus and attention. So, you know, we've actually literally, in addition to having things like the clinic on campus and all of that, we've built into our program from the very beginning to the time a student gets here in what we call peak performance fundamentals. The first week of their orientation, they have multiple activities around, from Alexander, you know, training to technique training to, you know, to hearing, you know, kinds of symposiums, to a panel with folks discussing injury prevention and care, and all of the things that are really central to you know, making our students aware of what these issues are. I think one of the challenges with young people particularly is that you think you're invincible, you know, and while it's possible to get injured when you're younger, and often people do, you're more likely to bounce back, of course, as well. What happens is as you age, as the body ages, and things accumulate, a lifetime of playing accumulates, you're more, and the body doesn't sustain that kind of abuse as well, if you will. It is, you're going to be more prone. And so, we're really trying to think about this holistically around this idea of, and Kris had touched on this earlier, prevention, awareness, right? And teaching our students to think about these issues from the very beginning, how to practice, how not to practice, what are the kinds, what's healthy, what isn't healthy. But also to be able to, advance the work that needs to be done in research around so many of these issues. Because one of the things that I think is, and even today, you can go to physicians, there are pockets of people that specialize in this, but rarely does it link back to, to what has to happen, for the rehabilitation of the player. And I think that's one of the most difficult issues is it's research, it's the clinical piece of it, it's treatment, and then it's what's the reentry point? And how do you link all of those things together, in terms of wellness of an artist? So what we're trying to do here, I think, is think holistically about all of those prongs, because they're all essential, I think, to this field. And Kris touched on this also. And I would just say that I think we often talk about this issue of the psychology of this. And I saw this, in the orchestra world. I've seen it with peers and colleagues over many, many years, people I've played with. If there's an injury, often the psychological ramifications of it are actually worse and more profound than the injury itself, and so how to cope, and even can cause the injury, in the sense of stress and what that does to you physically. So it's really actually an amazingly complicated ecosystem in a way, of reaction and interactions, and trying to sort that out. And and I think it is the reason I'm so excited about this is, again, I think we're starting to put together the pieces here of being able to really tackle these issues in a holistic way, which is what's really required.
A few minutes ago, Kris showed us his hands. Fred, I know you're a pianist, and there's a whole issue of the pianist and hands.
Yeah.
And when I worked at Lincoln Center established a relationship with what was then known as Roosevelt Hospital, about 7 blocks away. Now it's Mount Sinai West, where individual departments at Roosevelt form relationships with Lincoln Center. So the New York City Ballet and American Ballet Theater went to orthopedic and physical therapy departments. The pianist and other musicians went to the Hand Institute. There were famous hand surgeons. The ENT doctors took care of the singers and the actors. One of them, Anthony Yan, was on the show a couple of years ago. He was until recently medical director of the Metropolitan Opera. So that relationship exists. But I remembered one other aspect of pianists, and I know this applies to other performers as well: stage fright. When I was at the Metropolitan Opera, we often had Vladimir Horowitz come and perform on Sunday afternoons at 4 o'clock. And he had a whole set of rules, requirements, superstitions, repetitions that I had to adhere to help him get onto the stage and do what he did. And they were all anchored in stage fright. Do either of you have thoughts? Have you witnessed performers or colleagues where it really is psychological in terms of getting onto the stage?
I would certainly say, look, I think everybody that becomes a professional musician or not professional, you're an accomplished amateur and you may be involved in performances. I think, in my own experience in dealing with folks and in my own experience personally, I think it is what I found for myself was that I think one of the challenges for when you're a young artist is the number of opportunities that you have to play and actually perform. I think one of the things that happens, when you enter into the professional world if you're playing a lot, and I can relate to this personally. I mean, when I was, a doctoral student, and you played, you worked towards this one recital or however many recitals you had to do, and you put all the eggs were in that basket, and so you were, it's an enormous amount of pressure, and you get through it, and you perform, and you try things out, and you do all of that to cope with it. But one of the things that I personally experienced also when I got out into the professional world, and I played in a chamber group for about 8 years professionally, full time. And what I learned during that process was that, when I was playing 50 or 60 concerts a year, it completely changed my orientation around performing, because for me, it became, you get acclimated. That doesn't happen with everybody. There are some people that every single time they go out, they have stage fright. There are other people that, find ways of, everybody finds different ways to deal with it. One thing I would say, one of the things we really want to work towards here, we don't have it yet in place, but we would love to bring on a faculty member. Now, Kris, I know Sarah and you, I'm sure, have talked about this. We want to bring on at some point a faculty member who is really, is a performance psychologist. Because I think that is as important, as anything you're going to do I believe, in terms of the study of your instrument or the lesson, learning how to cope, learning how to psychologically prepare yourself for that, how to focus, how to block out some of the bad stuff. I think it is there are techniques, there are ways that people learn to do this, I think. And so, we're as interested, in that side of the equation as we are in, the physical piece of it.
Kris?
Yeah. Great topic. So as it relates to hands and piano and mental health challenges like performance anxiety or stage fright, these things are highly interactive. And they're, we use the term psychosocial, contextual, right? So there's a physical aspect to it, there's a psychological aspect to a social, and in whatever context these things are occurring in, also influence, they're all factors. So with hands, I've never really had any hand pain or per se, just have this anomaly. But I had a student early on, one of my first doctoral students, who came to talk to me. She was actually interested in music therapy. Her name was Ari Ushimura. And as we became, I became aware of what she was doing. She was studying piano with Dr. Pamela Paul. And she was having hand pain as a piano player, DMA classical piano player. And she was talking about how she was struggling mentally because she couldn't overcome the challenges to be able to play the Debussy preludes that she wanted to do for her last DMA recital, just too much hand pain. So we started talking about it, and that led to several research studies on this topic. And with her personally, as she became aware of her own physiology, as a woman and as an Asian woman, being smaller than a Caucasian woman, which are smaller stature than men for sure, she realized she had tiny hands. Mm-hmm. And at the time we were thinking about this, she was told by piano pedagogues that, the way to overcome this is to practice differently, change your technique, maybe do some cheating, just ways of managing this with what you've got as part of your physiology. And the more she did that, the problem got worse. And of course, she was thinking, maybe I'm not talented enough. Maybe, it's just something fundamentally that's beyond my capability. And she was getting very depressed. And then when she would practice or perform, she would get anxious because the hand pain would limit her ability to play it musically. So we started this years-long research project, which led to several other projects where we started looking at hand anthropometrics among our student population. We were making measures of hand span, hand length, hand girth, digit diameter, hand strength, grip strength, pinch strength, range of motion strength, pronation, supination, all kinds of characteristics, even trying to figure out postural deviations within the palm. And as we were exploring all these factors, we realized, wow, there's a huge variability in hand size within our students. So we had like 700 students' hands measured this way. And we realized that the difference between here and here with a fully stretched hand, difference between the smallest and the biggest was 4 inches. Okay, so if you're a piano player, you got 4 inches less hand than somebody else, you might have more difficulty playing on the same size instrument, which then led us to start thinking about modifying the piano, which has been introduced to the piano world formally, I think, maybe 15 years ago now, 20 years ago. Somebody came up with a computer-assisted design program that would allow the angles from the key to the hammer to be modified so that the keyboard can be shrunk down a little bit, and the octave is actually narrower than a standard octave, which was standardized, I guess, 100-something years ago, primarily by men. And so we got one of these inserts. We were talking about doing this kind of work at Peabody. And here's this young lady, she was trying to understand what factors are contributing to hand pain. She realized, wow, of all the things that we measured, one of the most impactful factors was hand span and digit-to-digit flexibility. Like some people just can't do this. They got different kind of tendon structures. So anyway, we got this piano and she started practicing on it and she acclimated to it almost immediately, and her confidence went up, her performance anxiety, her stage fright went way down. And she ended up playing her DMA recital, the music she wanted to play, and it was just so beautiful. I was crying because she now had the opportunity to be an artist without the limitations of somebody determining what size instrument they should play. And this led also to somebody in Japan, talking about Japan, a physician who's also a small statured physician, medical doctor. He took a sabbatical a few years ago and he went to all these museums across Europe and literally measured the octaves of all these historical pianos. And he traced it from Cristoforte to today. And you could see, as when it was first introduced, it was pretty much like it is now. But then over time, it was a lot of variability. And the average size of the octave was lower. It was smaller, which is why some people say, you know, some musicians with small hands composed certain things because it was approachable with a normal size hand. Or even like Chopin was writing octaves and things like this. He was a little boy. Well, he probably had a smaller piano.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's complicated because not only is there a physiological rationale for needing something that's suitable to your hand, right? Ergonomics. It's also challenging sort of the mindset of people in music that, no, we all should play the standard. And if you can't do what you need to do, then maybe you should do something else, right? As opposed to thinking, wow, we can change the instrument. The traditions here are very powerful.
Yes, everyone talks about Rachmaninoff's enormous hands. And if you don't have those, then you shouldn't be playing his music, or you can't play it well, is a famous example of that.
In fact, I was guest lecturer several times to the Clyburn piano amateur competitions, and I would bring this data, you know, and show these charts and figures and statistics and all that. And I remember a few of the contestants, of which my times there were all female, and somebody raised, hey, why is it there's never been a female who's won the Clyburn? Is this it?
Mm-hmm.
And after showing how accessible this other type of ergonomically modified period correct instrument has on piano players who are having these problems, published many papers on this, I asked the director of the Clyburn competition, you know, would you be willing to expand the options to your competitors, right? So, you know, if somebody's competing, you give a Hamburg Steinway or a New York Steinway. You get to pick, right? Which one do you like? What action do you like? What sound do you like? And I said, why don't we try it? I'll be responsible for making sure we have a Steinway with the modified keyboard, and we can just offer that as an option. Because we had this piano technician group at Denton that was working on all this. Wouldn't that be nice? This was in front of the female competitors, by the way, who were asking the question as to why a female has never won. And the response was no. Now we're into this social contextual factor, set of factors. Why not? You know, why would all trumpet players have to play the same size mouthpiece? Why would, we have different violins and violas and basses and all kinds of stuff. And yes, it's hard because there's pianos all over the world and you have to go play that piano. But even the idea that you can practice on a small piano with really good posture, less stretch, more curve in your hands, do all these things while you're learning a more difficult piece because of the hand size demands, the transferability to a standard piano makes it less likely that you'll have sustained piano related pain. So it's a fascinating connection between the physical, both in this, the cultural, the historical, the psychological, and
it touches on
Right.
this idea of, I do think, and you mentioned it, Kris, we are such a tradition bound based, field. And, from the way people are taught to, and the lineage, and there are wonderful aspects of that lineage, of course, as well. But I think, it is not, I mean, I joked actually when I was in the orchestra world, and I came to Peabody, and I said it out loud. I said, I didn't think it was possible to find a place more conventional and conservative than the orchestra world until I found the conservatory world. But by golly, we worked really hard to change that here and have in a lot of ways. But I think it's, as a field, whether you're talking about what instrument you play on or health, or, and even just fears around it, I think it is changing, but it changes really slowly. People wanting to hide the idea of injury and the lack of transparency around that and the fear around it. And I think, that all ties to this idea of tradition and that somehow this is all something to be overcome. And there's a way of doing it. And if you think beyond that way of doing it, that somehow you're not adhering or you're not doing things at the highest artistic level. And it all gets conflated in a way that, that doesn't always make a lot of sense. And I think that, I think one of the greatest challenges of our field, whether you're talking about future audiences or whether you're talking about how, the cultivation of performers, is how do you, it's where I started, earlier on when I was talking about Peabody, that how do you marry sort of innovation and forward looking, a view of the field and how to approach the field with what is a wonderful tradition, out of which we all come. How do you bring those two things together in a way that makes sense, and that serves both aspects of it in a really positive way. I think it's all part of that. There's a real sort of way of seeing things in our field history, historically, that I think has been very limiting, for our field.
Kris, if I were presented with that young pianist and she was saying her small hands presented a challenge, I would have gone back to look for other pianists with small hands, and I would have pointed her to Alicia de la Rocha, she was a tiny woman with tiny hands, and I would have just studied what did she play, and if it worked for her, that would be the point of departure. I'd like to bring up another topic that I don't know if you fellows have ever discussed, but I think is important in terms of the larger issue of performer wellness, and it's known as industrial hygiene. And industrial hygiene is a study in the theater and in performing arts spaces of what surrounds the performer. And I can give a personal example. I was performing at the new theater in St. Petersburg in Russia, this Mariinsky 2, it's called. And they were still forming their practices, and Russia does not necessarily have the highest standards in terms of the chemicals that performers and other people are exposed to. And I had a rehearsal, and they had just used the stage for some kind of ballet that had smoke effects. And whatever they used was not just dry ice, but it had a kind of oil in it. And I completely lost my voice. And I know about voice maintenance and how to preserve it. I completely lost my voice, and I, from Russia, contacted Dr. Yan at the Met, and he gave me advice for how to get through my performance in a half hour, but then I was not to speak for 2 weeks. And industrial hygienists, one of them that I know is named Monona Russell, tend to be the people who study and are troubleshooters for these environments, because it's not a given that we know what is best for musicians. In America, we have something called OSHA, Occupational Standards of Health, but not everyone, even with the best intentions, adheres to OSHA standards or industrial hygiene. Is that something either of you have dealt with or have thought about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you have, Chris, and I have both, in running halls and being in halls, with professional orchestras and dealing with issues. And look, some of this is just, how do you create a safe environment in terms of sound if you're playing in an orchestra, and the shields and the sound shields, and how is that managed, and earplugs. I mean, we all know that these are all factors in this. And in a pit, what are the issues of being, in an opera pit and playing in the pit? And what are the conditions in that pit, in terms of prevention of injury and particularly hearing loss and things like that? I think this extends to even things like, are the pianos in a place in good shape? The action on a piano. What are the problems with that piano, in terms of struggling to control the instrument? I think, to me, these are all things that have to do with, aside from if there's something foul in the air that shouldn't be there, these are all basic things that actually are in the workplace every day, in halls, and I think are not always, appropriately addressed.
Yeah, this is definitely something, Fred, that I've been thinking about a lot about. And I've had a strong relationship with National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health, which is the sister organization to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which regulates, right? NIOSH is the scientific wing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've come to realize that the need for specific protocols to understand if, when, and why the environment is hazardous is warranted. And one of the challenges with recognizing the need to integrate these industrial hygiene standards into a musical context, the biggest challenge to me is that they were never intended to be applied to a musical context. So there's a lot of nuances in terms of the protocols that would help us understand if, when, and particularly why a musical event is risky, like especially when it comes to sound. The fundamental assumptions with those protocols is that the energy, if equal, produces equal risk. It's called equal energy hypothesis. So regardless of what happens in an hour's worth of sound generation, it's that overall energy level that is used to qualify risk on a scale, regardless of what happens in time. And we know the way the ear responds physiologically and all the potential short-term shifts and sensibilities are dependent upon what happens in time. But an industrial hygienist wouldn't recognize that. Another thing is that the models to qualify risk are based on an assumption that a worker is going to go to work every day, 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, over a 40-year work life. That pattern of employment does not align with what a musician does, or if you try to apply that kind of a protocol or standard to an ensemble-based activity in a school, it falls way short. The good news is that there's tremendous amount of interest in this. It's just not quite developed technologically yet to understand some of these nuanced characteristics of the musical activity as it relates to these health consequences. I'm super excited about Johns Hopkins as a research institution, because they're not only funded as a center for occupational health within the School of Public Health as a regional center there. There's quite a bit of work that's done in the hearing loss area and the occupational hygiene area across all kinds of, things that are floating in the air, vapors, aerosols, toxins of all types. And to be able to connect with these people and think about these challenges as researchers, and then move it into more of a policy perspective so that we can actually come up with global practices that would make sense for the music industry. In fact, I was just in Geneva a few weeks ago at the World Health Organization's meeting where they're really concerned about our youth these days being exposed to too much music and music-induced hearing disorders because of iPads and earbuds and all this stuff. You know, not like when we were kids, you know, my kids, they walk around with things in ears all the time.
Mhm.
And so the first pass that the World Health Organization took was to mitigate the potential for a cell phone to generate levels and or inform the user that, you know, you've been overexposed. The second pass that they worked up recently was coming up with a formula that would set a criteria for need to adjust the musical activity in terms of sound level production. And this is mostly, not mostly, it's totally based on the idea that there would be amplified sound systems during a festival or a concert, and therefore an audio engineer. And the audio engineer is now guided by this standard where if the dB level exceeds 100 dB LEQ for 15 minutes, they have to turn the knobs down. It's like a moving window. So the meeting that we just had a few weeks ago was focused on, well, what do you do when there's no sound reinforcement involved? Or what do you do when there's no engineer turning the knobs on the amplifiers? Well, you first recognize that the musicians themselves that are controlling the sound levels. And until we come up with protocols to inform the musician as to if, when, and why musically you have elevated levels. And this is something that I'm really excited about working on here, especially with engineering and computer science and artificial intelligence. I think we can understand the temporal aspects of music in ways, which is really what music is, right? It's the control of sound energy over frequencies over time. We can better understand the temporal patterns as it relates to how the ear responds. Then we can start composing, we can start programming, we can start organizing our rehearsals as a reflection of our understanding of these nuances. And I'm totally convinced that the artistic level of these musical behaviors that have this insight will go up, because it will drive the music to be more dynamic. So you'll be able to maintain really high, loud, you know, like Pig Verdi with the bass drum, right? The Requiem. I mean, that's got to be, wow. You know, you don't want to turn that down. You don't want to put an earplug in. You want that. But in the context of musical dynamics, mathematically, statistically, you can actually lower the risk by spending more time at pianissimo.
As Verdi does the Requiem. I'm going to interrupt. I think the whole issue of what's called sound design, which is a term I hate, we're going to have to save for another time. I have a lot of opinions on it. I'll just say that I installed a decibel meter on my smartphone years ago. And if I'm in an environment where it goes above 75 for more than 10 minutes, I'm out, whether it's a restaurant or whatever, because I have to protect my hearing. I want to bring up a topic because I know we're time sensitive, and if I can, I'll bring up a second topic too. Doctors and music. In New York, we have Lenox Hill Hospital. There is a doctor's orchestra. And I know many doctors who have very deep relationships with music. Obviously, I didn't know Albert Schweitzer, but he took an organ to Gabon and played his organ. He played Bach in the jungle. And many doctors, Dr. Yan, of whom I spoke, is deeply connected to musicians and to music making. Have you, either of you, but especially Fred, perhaps because you've been in Baltimore longer, discovered at Hopkins the feelings that doctors have about music?
Oh yeah, by all means. You know, we've discovered it before, and I back in the days when I used to teach piano, I had doctors as students, but yeah, I mean, I could think of a number of folks at Hopkins. Alex Pentiolat, who's over in neurology. Alex is a violinist. There are a couple of guitar players. I mean, there are a bunch of folks actually over at the medical school that are serious, are serious artists actually, and with real experience as players. And I think there's a very strong connection. There are a lot of people that go into medicine that are, that studied music seriously and love music and are actually very good at it. So it's not surprising we would find them here. I think it's something that correlates in a lot of places.
I'm going
Yeah,
to tell us, yes,
I
Kris.
just wanted to follow up on it just for a sec. Not only are the physicians, but all other academics, particularly in areas where there's a strong research agenda. We have, Johns Hopkins has what, the #1 biomedical engineering program in the country. University of North Texas has a new biomedical engineering program. And when they started at UNT, I would be asked to go and talk to the freshmen, and I would go and they would introduce me, and the kids would look at me like, why are you even here, right? You're from the College of Music and you're a trumpet player and all that. And then I would ask them, how many of you played music seriously as a kid, including in high school? Amazing amount of students. How many of you actually contemplated going into music versus engineering? Smaller, but still a very large cohort. And how many of you struggle with the decision as to what to do? How many of you have contemplated doing both? Well, some of the most exciting research that I can conceptualize in my mind and have experienced is when people from different backgrounds, especially students who are trained in various research protocols, but have a common goal or common appreciation for arts. You bring people, now you're talking about transdisciplinary collaboration, convergence across disciplines. In fact, we were at Cornell a few weeks ago reporting on the development of a smart, custom-fitted tooth guard in response to our epidemiologic data that shows saxophonists and clarinetists, their #1 musculoskeletal site for pain is inside the lower lip, not the wrist, not the back, here. This is the one that devastates their ability to play. And of course, the teeth cut into the lip and you bite down on it. So I went over to the engineering senior design group early this past year and said, hey, anybody interested in this project? And sure enough, yeah, I played clarinet when I was a kid. Oh, I played flute. I'd love to get involved in something related to music. And sure enough, they worked on a custom fitted smart tooth guard. Didn't work out, yet, but just that idea of bringing these disciplines together to solve these very interesting and challenging projects are dependent upon these musical backgrounds that these people have, whether they're physicians.
Kris, I hope when you're here, you'll actually get to know some of our double degree students too, because we got Peabody students, and then they're doing something in engineering, or they're doing, and they're amazing. Frankly, I don't know how they do it myself. I don't know, but
So final topic for today, only because we are time sensitive, and I've loved talking to both of you. It's been very inspiring for me. An area that I take a lot of interest in addition to everything we've spoken about, I'm certainly interested in people with cognitive problems, Alzheimer's, dementias, and so on, and music. But I've also been very interested, based on my own life experience, in what we call music and the end. My father was a musician. He was a magnificent trombonist. He went professional at 13. My musical foundations began with him. I was a late speaker because he would practice at my crib rather than speak to me, so that somehow I got the music in me first. And I really had to learn to speak at a much delayed, I've caught up, but a much delayed point. My father was diagnosed with a very bad cancer with a bad prognosis, and he went into Sloan Kettering Hospital here in New York. And as we were packing up, I kind of knew he would never get out. And I watched what CDs he put in his bag for music that he would listen to while he was there. And it was fascinating. And it's something we can talk about another time. But he was unresolved about the end of his life. He was angry. He was depressed. This cancer came very quickly and was devastating. A surgery went wrong. And at a certain point, he didn't want to speak to me, and we were incredibly close, in English anymore. He just wanted to give up language and revert to what I realized was his and my original language, music. And he would only sing to me, and I knew what he meant and what he was talking about as he sang to me without words, sometimes just a cappella. And I realized that Dad was not going to be happy or resolved until certain issues were dealt with. And I, with WQXR Radio here in New York, programmed an hour at 11 p.m. of music that I felt would address what he was struggling with. And the lovely host of WQXR played it. It was, just for your reference, Strauss, Monsalvace, and Beethoven. And at the end of the hour, I said to him in language, I said, "Do you understand?" And he replied, "Yes, I do. It's all resolved now." And the concept of resolution in music suddenly was very striking to me. And that was midnight, and he died at 2:40 the next day, and he died resolved. You know, we were unhappy, but resolved. And I kept WQXR on the whole night. And just purely coincidentally, the music that was on when he died was Mozart's Parto Parto, I'm leaving, I'm departing, from La Clemenza di Tito. So when I am with people who are preparing for the end of life, I try to focus them on music, not to heal if you can't heal, but to resolve. And I hope that that's something that, you know, it doesn't seem like the immediate thing that you would address, but it's, whenever I've experienced that in working with people, it's very powerful, even if I don't have a personal emotional connection to them, because I've seen what music can do even when there's no hope. And so,
Well, thanks for sharing that, Fred. You know, my dad passed away many years ago from cancer. And so I can definitely relate to this. He was home, his hospice came upon suddenly. He was about 60, he's pretty young. And I would fly up from Texas with my trumpet, my flugelhorn, and sit in the living room and just play what I felt as though, which, you know, soothe his anguish, you know. The physical pain was one thing, but just the, and I just always had in my mind that he might somehow have felt more at ease or resolved, knowing that, you know, his kids were expressing, you know, their feelings with him musically. Never really talked about it, but yeah, and then the whole idea of music in hospice is hugely important. For those reasons, I have a really dear friend. In fact, she was featured on Oprah Winfrey years ago as the flying music therapist. And she got her pilot's license because she was afraid of flying. And then she bought a plane and she would fly out to West Texas with her harp and land at some little regional airport and sit at the bedside of people who are at this stage in life and play and talk about these things. Very, very powerful. Yeah, appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, beautiful.
So I should remember, and I don't, the name of the composer who said, "Where words end is where music begins." Was it Mahler? It sounds like it could be, but I don't know. But I think that that's a big part of what we're talking about today. I want to underline for listeners, again, we're talking about two things really: musician and performer wellness, but also palliative uses of music to treat disease. I'm thrilled, Kris, that you've arrived at Hopkins. I'm admiring, Fred, that you had the wisdom to bring him. I'm going to be following all of your activities because I think you're doing the Lord's work. And I thank you both.
Thanks for having us. It was a really interesting conversation, and I learned a lot.
Yeah,
I'm going to take you to Milan, and we're going to go to that place. How about that?
It sounds, I love it.
and then Istanbul to the musical pharmacy.
Never been to Turkey, actually, so I would.
Oh, it's the music is phenomenal. Oh boy.
No,
and the food.
Yeah, yeah.
And finally, my beloved Johann in Berlin, you have been the stellar collaborator for all of these years here at Idagio, and I miss you already. And I thank you for all the good work and all the great musical programming that you have created and will continue to do so. So, gentlemen in Baltimore, see you soon. And Johann,